Stroke is listed as the second leading cause of death worldwide, and it's very misunderstood. There are 3 types of stroke. Each of these has very different causes, and each actually has a solution that you've very likely never heard of. But only one of these 3 types of stroke is a real stroke. Nature makes no mistakes. God does not play dice. Instead, all of creation springs forth according to a few simple, elegant rules. All of creation, including your body. Know these rules and your body comes under your control. Welcome to Mind Over Symptom, where the pattern is revealed. The World Health Organization lists stroke as the number 2 killer in the world. Today's episode aims to broaden your understanding of what stroke is and why it happens, so that you can find a practical solution. So a stroke is when you develop sudden weakness or numbness of the face, arm, leg, one side of the body, one area of the body, or even the whole body. The diagnosis of stroke is also made with loss of vision or dimming, like a curtain falling in front of one or both eyes, or with a sudden loss of speech or difficulty talking or understanding what others are saying, or with a sudden severe headache with no known cause, or with a loss of balance or unstable walking, usually combined with another one of the symptoms I just mentioned. Now, the information about stroke from mainstream sources is pretty scary and provides few options for protecting yourself or for recovering if you've had one of these symptoms. But mainstream medicine and most alternative health approaches are not aware of the 5 natural laws of healing. They're not aware that symptoms occur for a reason, and that symptoms are evolved responses developed by nature over millions of years to protect our bodies and to make us able to overcome challenges better. Today's episode of the Mind Over Symptom podcast aims to open up your knowledge of what exactly is going on when these types of symptoms occur, so that you'll be equipped with new ideas and opportunities to imagine a completely different approach to preventing these symptoms and recovering if they've already posed a problem for you. But first, the official, although incorrect, story about what's going on when you have a stroke. So, not being aware of how the symptoms of loss of control of the body develop, the prevailing paradigm is that a stroke is a result of straight-up brain damage. It's believed to be brain damage caused by mechanical failure of the blood vessels in the brain, which causes shortage of oxygen to an area of the brain, and then the alleged brain damage results from that. The cause of this stoppage of the blood flow is believed to be physical blockage or rupture of the blood vessel in the vicinity of the area of the brain that was damaged. In the official paradigm, we categorize strokes by the severity of the symptoms, but our understanding of the severity of the symptoms is based on our belief about how the blood vessels got blocked or damaged in the first place. It's a little bit convoluted, so I'll just describe the official types of stroke. First, there's what's called ischemic stroke. It's believed to be the cause of most strokes. Ischemic stroke is when a blood vessel in the brain is blocked by a clot or by a buildup of plaque made of cholesterol and fat cells, so says the official story. This is the exact same belief as the prevailing paradigm of coronary artery disease, and it's not accurate, as I'll explain shortly. Second, we have TIA, which stands for transient ischemic attack, also known as a mini stroke or a warning stroke. This is the model that's used to explain why some strokes can be recovered from. In this view, it's believed that a clot only temporarily blocked the artery in the brain, causing a mini stroke or a warning stroke that produces symptoms for just a little while, like the damage didn't really occur in the brain, it just sort of threatened to. Lastly, there's what medical practitioners call hemorrhagic stroke. This is a condition where an artery breaks open, technically called an aneurysm. Since the artery breakage is in the brain, it's called a brain aneurysm. There can also be what are called stroke symptoms because of pressure in the brain due to swellings or enlargement of the brain structures nearby. These symptoms, sometimes classified as stroke, include things like numbness, tingling, just strange body sensations. So stroke is hard to prevent and treat with conventional and most alternative approaches. This is because few people, very few people, including health professionals, know is that stroke is rarely, if ever, a result of a mechanical blockage or failure of the blood vessels of the brain. Stroke is actually a result of something going on in the brain itself, a program of nature. It's on purpose. The brain is doing it for a reason. This response of the brain is happening as a response to stress that you are experiencing in your psyche, not as a response to a physical stress acting directly on your brain. I just needed to explain this fundamental difference to you so that I can get to how to fix the problem just a little bit later in the episode. But medicine, conventional and alternative, generally believes that all strokes are types of mechanical failure of the blood vessels in the brain, either blockage or rupture. And these blockages, if it's a blockage, are caused by cholesterol and fats, etc., plaquing up in the blood vessel, the same as ischemic heart disease, or rupture caused by a weakness of the artery in the brain, which is thought to be just sort of bad luck, maybe a bad genetic hand that was dealt to us. And then the severity of the stroke is thought to be based on whether there's no damage, mild damage, or permanent damage to the brain. And these features may perhaps be present during the stroke, blood clots or damage to blood vessels in the brain. They may be present during the stroke, but they're not causes of the stroke, symptoms. And they're not causes of the stroke itself. Let's say for a moment that somehow chunks of blood or plaque or weakness of the arteries do lead to stroke symptoms, just for the sake of discussion of working through this idea. So it's actually not helpful to just say that this problem with the blood vessel causes the stroke, because we're done. At that point, we have no options. What we need to ask, if we do believe that it's blood vessels that are causing brain damage and the brain damage is leading to the stroke, we need to ask actually what causes the blockage or the rupture, because that would be the actual cause of the stroke. So let's just let go of talking about the blood vessels in the brain altogether. It's very convoluted. It's a kind of a circular logic, this point of view on how it works. So let's just put that paradigm aside as though we'd never even heard of it. So what we're now looking at is something going on in the brain that causes us to lose function in some part of the body. Again, we hit up against the paradigm. If something in our brain makes us lose function in some part of our body, the prevailing belief is that it must be damage in the brain. The brain must be malfunctioning. And this, too, is a paradigm that I would like to set aside, because consider for a moment that the brain could be doing what it's doing for a reason. It may not be an accident of the brain. I want to briefly explain something about brain damage as well. Except for a complete removal of large areas of the brain, or death of the entire brain, meaning death of the entire person, there's actually no such thing as permanent damage to the brain. The brain is the most plastic, healable part of the entire body. All you have to do is stimulate it. Stroke isn't a problem of damage to the brain at all, or at least it's not caused by damage to the brain. Stroke is merely a symptom, and it has another cause altogether. That cause is in accordance with the 5 natural laws of healing, which I've discussed in a lot more detail in episode 2 of the Mind Over Symptom podcast, but here's a quick overview. The first natural law of healing is that every symptom begins as a stress response due to a biological conflict experience, that is, a traumatic stress experience. The second natural law of healing is that every emergency stress response to a biological conflict, that is, every symptom, has both an active stress response phase and a healing phase. And there are different symptoms in the body, brain, and psyche, depending whether the original conflict experience is still active or it's been resolved. The third natural law of healing says that the type of conflict experience will determine which part of the brain, body, and psyche respond to that conflict experience. The fourth natural law of healing says that we can switch on our immunity against conflict experiences not by changing the world around us, not by putting a defense system against the world around us, but by changing the way that we react to events and experiences in our lives. And finally, the fifth natural law of healing says that by overcoming conflict experiences, we evolve into more capable people. This is why we respond to stress and why we get stressful situations rather than just avoiding the whole thing, rather than just sort of sitting in the corner, letting things just come to us. In other words, life is actually about overcoming obstacles, and this is the mechanism by which it happens. We have stresses, we respond to them, then we resolve them, then we heal. And so overcoming obstacles is our goal with any symptom, including stroke. The goal is to resolve the challenge, to resolve the conflict by moving through and past it. But not knowing any of these 5 natural laws of healing, the conventional approach to stroke is to try to predict vulnerability and then just sort of use dietary or lifestyle avoidances for as long as possible to just try to run away from that challenge. So let's get on to the true cause of stroke and what to do about it. Okay, so there are 3 types of biological conflict, that is traumatic stress experiences, which cause what we have come to call stroke. Each of these produces different recognizable signs and therefore is potentially healable. And all 3 are quite different from one another. First, there's hot stroke. Hot stroke is when we temporarily lose control of an area of our body, like when one side of our body goes or face goes slack, or we lose control of our legs, like in paraplegia. A hot stroke isn't really a stroke. It's a motor conflict, which in the healing crisis produces an epileptic seizure, which is a tonic-clonic, that is a rhythmic spasming of muscles in the area of the body that's affected, or in the entire body, depending on the exact details of the original motor conflict experience. That was a mouthful. So what is a motor conflict then? A motor conflict is a brain-mediated biological response to a traumatic stress experience affecting the motor cortex area of the brain. Now, motor cortex conflicts are always conflicts of feeling trapped. They're actually the play-dead reflex. You've probably heard of the fight-flight response about a zillion times, but there's actually a third component to this stress reaction. The fight-flight response is actually a fight, flight, or freeze response. If you can neither fight nor flee the dangerous situation, that is, if you're trapped in it, your motor cortex shuts down signals to the part of your body involved in the trap situation. It goes slack. Picture a deer at the moment that it's caught by a predator. The whole body goes slack. It's a last-ditch escape mechanism devised by nature. We call it the play-dead reflex. Possums are famously going into this conflict at the slightest threat. My guess is because they aren't very good at either fighting or fleeing, but they're sure good at playing possum, which means a lot of time when you think a possum's dead, they've actually just gone totally slack. It's the play-dead reflex caused by feeling trapped. A little while later, after the danger has passed, they'll have a healing crisis, which is a bunch of muscle twitches, and then they'll be on their merry way with their muscle control back to normal. The motor conflict, as soon as the conflict begins, produces muscle paralysis, loss of muscle control. This is typically diagnosed as MS, ALS, low muscle tone, Parkinson's, and a few other labels for the condition of having lost control of the muscles of the body, depending on the style of how it actually plays out. If the conflict is only for a very specific situation, the paralysis won't affect the entire body. For example, maybe you need to literally or metaphorically dig your heels in to prevent yourself from being dragged into a dangerous situation or a dangerous area. Your brain would take that literally and would actually shut off control to your legs, producing paraplegia. This is your brain creating a literal response to a traumatic stress experience. The paralysis could affect just one side of your body. This would be because the motor conflict involves a specific other person rather than a general physical situation. We respond with different sides of our body depending on whether the relationship that's the source of the conflict is a mother or child relationship or a partner relationship. So if you feel trapped in relation to your child, for example, such as if you feel that maybe your hands are tied, you can't rescue your child from a dangerous situation, then your hand and arm on your non-dominant side, which is your mother-child side, would be affected. Even Bell's palsy is an example of the play-dead or freeze or entrapment conflict. The situation is extremely specific. It has to do with feeling trapped by a public humiliation experience. That is, feeling that you're damned if you do, damned if you don't in a social sense. Which side of your face it affects? Again, it relates to, does it have to do with being shamed in relation to a mother-child or shamed in relation to a partner? We call the type of stroke that occurs in the motor cortex and makes one area or one side of your body or your whole body go slack. We call this a hot stroke because of the 2 phases of progression of diseases. The first active phase of the conflict when we're in an active stress response is the cold phase, while the second healing phase after we resolve the conflict is the hot phase. There's literally a feeling of coldness when we're in a stress active phase and a feeling of warmth, fevers even, when we're in a healing phase. The traumatic situation of feeling trapped is usually quite temporary. As soon as the situation goes away, we promptly go into the healing phase. But in the case of motor cortex conflicts, the muscle paralysis actually gets temporarily worse in the healing phase. So the healing phase of this particular type of conflict is a worse version of the conflict active phase. This temporary worsening of the muscle tone forces the body to rest while neurons and muscle fibers are restored in the healing phase. Now, when the healing phase of any stress response is substantially complete, there's always a healing crisis. In the case of a motor cortex conflict, the healing crisis will be an epileptic seizure in the affected area of the body. Literal twitching, rhythmic twitching, or tonic-clonic seizures. It can be the whole body or it can just be the part of the body involved. With the hot stroke, there may also be tingling and numbness in the part of the body involved, and that's because healing at the brain level can produce brain swelling in the motor cortex, and this fluid can create pressure against the adjacent sensory cortex in the brain directly behind the motor cortex. Having said all this about the hot stroke, it's not really a stroke. A hot stroke isn't really a stroke. It's just the play-dead reflex. It's a programmed response of nature. And we know it's a hot stroke, that is, it's not a stroke at all, but a motor conflict followed by an epileptic seizure as part of the healing crisis, because if and when the conflict is resolved, and as long as there's no relapse of the conflict, the symptoms of paralysis will pass. Muscle control will be regained, and there'll be this twitchy epileptic seizure as part of that. Unfortunately, the diagnosis shock of MS, stroke, or paraplegia can constitute a new entrapment conflict, one so severe that we may never resolve it. This is particularly true when professionals who we trust tell us such things as, "You'll never be able to walk again," or "Get your affairs in order, you've suffered permanent brain damage and your condition will only get worse from now on." This is a new shock and can be unresolvable unless we have the right information. And it's sad. And it's why it's so important to learn about the 5 natural laws of healing so that you can take charge of your body, commit to self-care, and give yourself the best chance of resolving your conflict for good. Now, a cold stroke is a real stroke. And what I mean by that is it's the closest thing to what is medically diagnosed as an injury to the brain. This type of stroke can occur anywhere in the brain, and the symptoms will relate to whichever part of the brain is involved. But in the case of cold stroke, you have almost certainly already experienced this particular symptom many, many times before. Because the cold stroke is a result of a chronically relapsing conflict, resolving it, going through the healing crisis, and then relapsing back into that conflict again. The cold stroke is a healing crisis, as happens in the hot stroke, and in fact happens in all illnesses, as long as the conflict has been resolved. But in a cold stroke, the healing crisis this time just snaps the brain. See, what happens is the healing crisis, like the original conflict experience, it takes place simultaneously in all 3 systems of your organism. Your body, where the symptom such as blurred vision or loss of speech is manifested. Your psyche, where the conflict or traumatic stress experience occurs. And in your brain, which is the receiver and transmitter that relates between the other 2 systems. So it occurs in all 3 of these systems simultaneously, both the conflict and the healing, and of course the healing crisis. In the case of a cold stroke, it's a healing crisis that's occurring for the umpteenth time in the same part of the brain. The brain tissue has, in this part of the brain, become brittle from constant activity in the same location, constant relapse, first an active conflict, then a healing phase, possibly with swelling and fluid pressure, and then the healing crisis, and then the same kind of conflict again and again and again. And they've been in this situation for a long time. Now, the brain is extraordinarily resilient, so this can go on for many decades, but eventually there is a limit. Cold strokes are the type of stroke experienced by elderly people just because they've had a lot more years in which to experience the same repeating conflict. So what happens is scar tissue, technically called glia, it develops in the brain at this site with each round of the 2 phases of the illness. These glia cells are more like nodes. They're locations where brain cells, neurons, reach out to and reach out from. They're more like anchor points. They don't have the ability to grow to these great lengths like typical nerve cells. So eventually, the net result is that the elasticity of the brain tissue in this area, it's made up more and more of these little glia cells instead of these long, stretchy neurons. And so the elasticity of the brain tissue itself effectively just hits a limit. The brain tissue becomes brittle, relatively, and the synapses snap during a healing crisis because there's not enough synaptic tissue. There's more of this glia scar tissue. Now, as I said, the brain is extraordinarily healable. It's the most plastic and malleable part of the body. Studies have shown that we can produce measurable brain growth in adults with as little as 2 hours of brain stimulation. Even in a cold stroke, then, the brain can build new tissue as a bridge over the damaged area, but the content of the conflict will probably be gone. For this reason, it's common for victims of this type of stroke to have interesting changes to the way their minds work. For example, after a stroke, someone's eyesight might suddenly improve, or they may forget that they're addicted to cigarettes or alcohol, or they may have a sudden change of personality so that they react with compassion when everyone's used to them having a huge temper flare-up in that type of situation, or vice versa. Unfortunately, like a kindly grandmother may suddenly, after her stroke, start screaming at you when this type of situation comes up. It's because the part of the brain that's been constantly reacting for years and years in the same way is now literally missing. So the brain is plastic and self-healing and happily grows a whole new pathway using whatever tissues are available around the damage relay. But this is a new piece of brain you've got. It's not going to react in the same pattern. Cold strokes can be deadly because they can occur in a vital area, such as in the area that controls heartbeat or breathing. You can't grow new brain in these areas in as fast a time as you need, so that you can't grow a new part of your brain to breathe in the minute or two that you need to grow it. But really, people do recover from cold strokes all the time. I'd like to mention now brain aneurysm, because this is attributed as a cause of stroke in all the conventional paradigm, in all the conventional literature and information. But an aneurysm in the brain, of course, it's not a stroke at all. An aneurysm is the result of a very long-standing territorial loss conflict, which creates depression and causes ulceration of the linings of the coronary arteries. I went into detail of how and why this happens in episode 4 of the Mind Over Symptom podcast. The same thinning of the arterial wall of the coronary artery during territorial loss and depression also takes place simultaneously in an artery in the brain, because, like all diseases, it occurs in the body, in the brain, and in the psyche simultaneously. In this case, the psychological component, the mind component, is depression. This thinning of the arterial wall is technically called ischemic necrosis. It leads to eventually, or it can eventually lead to a rupture, a bulge and a rupture in the arterial wall called an aneurysm. It can also reach this extreme state in the brain, and so the bulging and or rupturing of the artery in the brain would be called a brain aneurysm. It's not to do with a healing crisis. It's not to do with a freeze conflict, a play dead conflict. It's to do with the thinning of the artery wall reaching such an extent that the artery ruptures. And yes, this does cut off blood flow to the brain, and that can kill you, but it's not a stroke and it doesn't cause stroke. The way to prevent a brain aneurysm is to resolve territorial loss conflicts and their associated depression. Unfortunately, if a territorial loss conflict has gone on so long that the associated artery in the brain has deteriorated to the point of an aneurysm, then the healing phase of the territorial loss conflict would likely produce such a massive coronary heart attack that would kill you. So this is just another reason why it's so important to resolve coronary artery disease, depression, and territorial loss promptly. Now, how to prevent stroke? The key to preventing stroke is simple. It's not easy, of course, but it's simple. The way to prevent a real stroke, a cold stroke, is just like the way to prevent a brain aneurysm. It's to resolve your conflicts rather than sort of putting up with them or chronically relapsing in and out of them for months, years, or decades. We tend to get set in our ways, and this is what makes us susceptible to stroke later on in life. I believe we do this for cultural reasons, that we're commonly brought up to be nice people who stuff our problems and just go along to get along, follow the herd, focus on being normal. But as much as we would like our bodies to follow what society says we should do, our bodies are completely and utterly selfish, and only interested in following our deepest desires. It's not healthy to avoid facing our problems. The reason we have obstacles and problems in life is because these present an opportunity to grow, to evolve, to become more than we were. This is the fifth natural law of healing. That is, the reason we have conflict experiences in the first place is because life is giving us an opportunity to overcome them. It's the basis of all biological evolution. In fact, overcoming challenges is the basis of all forms of creativity, really. If a conflict keeps relapsing, if the same traumatic stress keeps happening again and again and again, it means we're avoiding our challenges rather than striving to overcome them. We've given up. We're running on autopilot. It's all too common. As Benjamin Franklin sadly observed, many people die at 25 and just aren't buried till 75. But take heart, fellow traveler. We're living in a time of intense cultural change, a shifting global paradigm. Welcome to the self-care revolution. It's finally becoming cool to be your own person rather than part of the crowd. So face your demons down for once and for all. What wonderful new life do you want to create for yourself today? This has been episode 5 of the Mind Over Symptom podcast. I'm Lishwi Springford, your guide for radical self-healing. I study the work of Dr. R.G. Hammer, a cancer doctor from Germany who discovered 5 natural laws which govern the course of all illness. All credit for this information goes to Dr. Hammer and his first generation of students, doctors, and health practitioners all around the world who are saving lives and in many situations reversing the statistics of conventional medical care. All errors in the information are mine. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe now, and please also rate and review the podcast so that I can get your feedback and use it to continue to improve what I do. You can connect with me, Lishwi Springford, via my website at mindtreehealth.net, where I have links to my various channels, as well as contact information to help you get further support in the form of my free 6-lesson Mind Over Symptom training delivered to your email inbox. You can also get direct support from me to help you uncover and resolve your symptom at its source. Links to these and other info from the episode are in the show notes. I look forward to being with you again soon. Until then, be well and have a great day. I hope you enjoyed Mind Over Symptom. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe now and please share with a loved one. The Mind Over Symptom blog lives at mindtreehealth.net, where you can get your free training about the natural laws of healing, and you can also get support. I'm Lishwi Springford, your guide for radical self-healing.